Hi everyone, I'm Shelly and you're watching There's No Place Like Home. It's been a while since I've done a Question the Narrative video, and this is a topic that has interested me for some while, but I actually got a renewed interest in it from watching a video on the John Levi channel the other day, and I'll get to how that happened a little bit later. But how much do you know about the World's Fair? I'm not going to talk so much about the World's Fair itself today, but about the actual architecture, the building, because that in itself is something that really makes you think once you actually go back to the time period that a lot of these fairs took place in and realize that it kind of seems to be out of place. So the first time that I actually heard of a World's Fair was in Men in Black when they mentioned the Coney Island World's Fair. So like when you picture the Coney Island World's Fair, it just looks like a typical fair. When I hear fair, I think carnival. That's what comes into my mind, some sort of big festival. And really that's what a lot of these images from the Coney Island Fair look like. And I believe this one took place in 1939. But what I'm really interested in are the older World's Fairs, because if you look down here, the World's Fair actually began in 1851. The first one was actually, I believe it was in London, it was in England, and, well, you'll see. Let's first of all head over to the Crystal Palace in London. So this is a rendering of the Crystal Palace in 1851. And while we are looking at these photographs, I want you to think about the time period that we are living in, and I want you to look at the architecture. So this is a rendering of what the Crystal Palace looks like, and right here is an actual photo of the Crystal Palace in 1851. And I don't know about you, but when I think of the 19th century, I don't think of stuff like this. Look at how landscaped it is. Look at this beautiful building. And you know, it really is like that with most of the older World's Fairs. Let's look at some World's Fair buildings here. They're amazing. This was in 1893. Now, again, look at the architecture. Look at the intricacy. And here's the thing. The storyline of the World's Fair buildings is that they were created, the landscaping and the buildings were created for the World's Fair. And most of it was actually destroyed after the World's Fair is over. So imagining not only having all the resources in the 19th century, but the technology to build things like this? How did they do this in the 19th century when, in fact, a lot of people were first getting settled? When I think, again, of 19th century, this is not what I'm thinking. So how are they doing it? How did they build these things? Now, something else that they will tell you is that the reason that this is the Chicago World's Fair, I believe, I'm not sure, but Chicago World's Fair is actually what I'm going to be focusing on a lot today. But again, look at the columns, the details. How are they doing this? How is a civilization that is transported by horse and buggy and, as far as I know, does not have power tools or cranes, how did they do this? And how is it that it was such an easy feat for them that they were able to do this in such a short amount of time? It doesn't add up. And I know that a lot of people are speculating that many of these World's Fair buildings were actually there when the people first settled. They were left there by another civilization that had already been living in America. And, you know, it's interesting to think about. Am I saying that that's 100% true? No. But I am saying that, yeah, sometimes you really need to wonder about the history that we're taught, because we know that a lot of it is made up. And unfortunately, a lot of the information that we get from about the World's Fair comes from the Smithsonian. And I think that we've learned that the Smithsonian really, unfortunately, can't be trusted. So, and there's just some more photos. So let's take a look at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. This is 1893 Chicago World's Fair. I am going to remind you, this landscaping and these buildings were all built for the World's Fair. Now, they claim that it took them 3 years to get all of this set up. The World's Fair itself lasted 6 months. But they claim that it took them 3 years to set this all up, and most of it was actually taken down afterwards. They claim that the reason that it was so easy was because the buildings were just made of plaster and chicken wire. But to me, that doesn't really, again, something else that doesn't add up, because if you look inside, this is also from the Chicago World's Fair. You can look inside these buildings. Now, according to articles, it says that 27 million people visited the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And these buildings, oh, you can't see inside, I don't think. Maybe there's one down here. Okay, here we go. So yeah, so people could travel through the buildings there. These weren't just buildings that were there that you just look at the outside and say, oh, they're so pretty, and then you just move on. No, you could actually walk. They were actual buildings. And in fact, what they do say is that a lot of these buildings were taken down, and they were just kind of, I don't remember if it was auctioned off or if kind of like scavengers like bought the pieces of the buildings they claim. But why would you do that? Why would you spend so much time building these structures only to take them down? And again, we're going to go back to, people are going to say, well, but they said that they weren't real buildings. Well, they were real buildings, because you can't go inside of a building that is not real. 27 million people in the 19th century who ride horses and buggies are able to go into these beautiful buildings that a lot of them were just seen to be disposable. But the thing is that a lot of them were not disposable. Right here is a picture of one of the buildings from one of the World Fairs. It was from the Panama Pacific. It was from the Panama Pacific International Exposition. And it was actually sold. And they actually floated it down the river to take it to where it was going to go. So why would somebody buy something if it was not a real building? You know, they do move buildings all the time. You can actually see an example of this in one of the John Levi videos that I just watched. I'll leave a link to his channel because it really is amazing. He has so much information on these World's Fairs. But it just really goes back to the fact that we need to start questioning the things that we are told. Is it possible? Is there even the slightest possibility that these buildings may have already been there? Oh, one thing that I actually forgot. So I was talking about the Chicago World's Fair. And so again, let's go back to what it looked like at the Chicago World's Fair. And this was in 1893. So let's just look at a little bit of Chicago history. So Chicago was founded in 1830, but there was the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. So it says here, after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which destroyed several square miles, and I should mention that the World's Fair in Chicago, I believe, took up 690 acres. But anyway, so this Chicago Fire of 1871 destroyed several square miles and left more than 100,000 people homeless. The city made a concerted effort to rebuild. The construction boom accelerated population growth throughout the following decades, and by 1900, less than 30 years after the Great Fire, Chicago was the 5th largest city in the world. Well, okay, that's great, but here's my question. So the Chicago Fire was in 1871. They had all of this rebuilding to do. They had 100,000 homeless people. Why would they take out 3 years of that time to build something that wasn't even permanent and was only going to be used for a 6-month fair? It doesn't make sense. Another point that I wanted to make is that although they claim that these buildings were made of plaster and chicken wire, but we saw by the floating building that that is probably not the case, at least for a lot of them. Possibly some of them were like that, but a lot of them were not like that. There are actually some relics left over from a lot of the World's Fairs. So if they are still using a lot of these buildings, how can they then turn around and say that they were not real buildings? So right here, this is from the Chicago World's Fair, the Palace of Fine Arts in 1893. And if you look down here, it is still being used today. So much for it not being a real city. I'm sorry, not city, building. So a lot of the narrative that we're being told doesn't make any sense. And I know that I keep saying that, but it's because it really has me thinking. Could, and I'm going to say it again, could it be possible that a lot of these buildings here were already here when a lot of the settlers came, and that there really had been another group of people here? I don't know what happened to them. I don't know where they went, but it just doesn't seem like it would be feasible for a 19th century civilization to be able, who was actually first settling a lot of these areas, to be able to create buildings like this. So what some people believe is that since they did get rid of a lot of these buildings, that they were kind of going to do these World's Fairs as like a big send-off, and then they were going to get rid of the buildings once and for all, like kind of knock them down. And I don't know. I don't know if that's what really happened, but what I am going to tell you is that I do not believe for a second that these buildings, this one's not loading, I do not believe for a second that these buildings were just built to be disposable and were only built for a fair. Now, one more interesting thing is that in one of the John Levi videos that I was watching, he actually showed a city in Ashgabat, Turkmenistan. And this really, to me, looks like what the World's Fair would have looked like. Now, I'm not saying that this is old like the World's Fair buildings, because I believe that this was first built in I believe that this was built in the early 2000s. So, you know, I'm not saying, oh, these are old World's Fair buildings and they're hiding them from us. No, nothing like that. But I think that it gives us a good idea of what they look like, because if you look here and then you look here, I think that it's strikingly similar. And in fact, what I find even more striking is my mouse is like going crazy on me. This is Ashgabat, Turkmenistan at night. Let's go back to this photo of what Chicago 1893 World's Fair looked like at night. And really, spend some time going through these photos, because me scrolling through them like this does not give it justice. It's just, unfortunately, I only have 15 minutes, so I can't spend like an hour doing this. But okay, here we go. This is Chicago 1893. This is, oh, sorry, that's not the one. Ashgabat now. So anyway, just some food for thought. And I will be doing another video about the World's Fairs soon, hopefully, because there are a lot of really interesting and puzzling things about these World Fairs beyond just the architecture and who built the buildings and were they really there before the people actually came. Did people actually come in and take over these buildings and it was actually a new population of people? I don't know, but I will tell you that the Coney Island World's Fair actually had incubator babies on display. People could go and see babies in incubators at the Coney Island's World's Fair. My question is, what is all that about? That's just one of many things that I'd like to talk about in a future video about the World's Fair. But again, really look into this, because it's crazy to think about what could possibly be real. Anyway, that's all that I have for you today. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed yet and would like to hear more of what I have to say, I would love if you would do that. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave one over on Instagram, because YouTube disables my comments. And if you like my work and would like to check out my Patreon page, I will leave a link in the description box for that as well. And I hope you have a great day.